Thanks, Aaron. Hi, everyone. So my name is Rogal, and I'm a developer program engineer at Google, specifically for the AdWords API, along with everyone else in the room who is also either going to be a developer advocate or a developer program engineer. So just to give you a brief introduction about our job and what our core duties are, we try and help developers develop for our API. So that means writing code samples, writing documentation, writing client libraries, doing hack days like these, and supporting our APIs through forums and through email and phone calls.
Adam, can you use the mic? Sorry.
Sure thing.
Thanks.
Okay. So what I'm going to be talking about first today is migrating from v13 to v2009. Just a show of hands, how many people here have started migrating? Great. Okay. So it looks like a few of you haven't, so it should this should be a good kind of introduction to it. For those of you who have, we're going to reiterate on a few points, and I'll have some best practices. And as Aaron said, if this seems a little boring, there's Wi-Fi, and you can start coding on your own stuff or asking the people in the back any questions. So first off is the timeline. And I'm sure many of you have heard of this so far, but there's going to be a sunset of our v13 services on April 22nd, 2010. So what does this mean? There's going to be two parts. The first part that's going to be sunset is going to be all the campaign management stuff, info service, and targeting idea, the services that equate to targeting idea service. So essentially, you can get started on all the people who've said that they've begun migrating. That means that they've probably been migrating over the campaign management stuff. They've been keeping their, started migrating maybe their targeting stuff from targeting ideas service, and maybe migrating over their info service, as well as exploring ad parameters and bulk mutate job service. There will be a full v13 sunset. The way we're going to approach this is every time a service is released that has feature parity of its v13 equivalent, then we set a sunset clock of 4 to 6 months before that service is deprecated and turned off. Sorry, sunset. It's deprecated when a feature parity version is released. So, for example, one on here that I don't have is report service. So the v2009 version of report service is in the works. It's close to being released. And when it does, what we're going to do is make sure that it's feature parity. We're going to get feedback. And when we believe it's reached feature parity, that's when we set the sunset clock. So we're still giving plenty of time to migrate over the services that we haven't released yet. Okay, and if anyone has any questions, feel free to ask questions as we go along, but we'll have a lengthy Q&A session after this as well. So some of the resources to upgrade to v2009. I think one of the greatest resources is our client libraries. So just to show of hands, how many people in here use one of our client libraries? Okay, so roughly half the room saying they do. My job today is to convert the other half. Whether or not, if you're not using the client library, you really want to know why. I think we had one of these sessions in San Francisco a little bit ago, and the key feedback that we got from there was, well, one, I didn't know the client libraries existed, so today we're saying here they are. The other one was, I can't use it because my system does X and X and X, and my environment is X and X and X. And we try and make sure that the client libraries reach that nice little, big part of the bell curve in terms of compatibility with people's systems. So please let us know. Give us feedback. Why can't you use it? I've used it before and I didn't like it. We care about all kinds of feedback, and we really want to make sure that people use the library. Why do we want to make sure that people use the library? v2009 has a few gotchas. There's issues with namespacing. So I think if some of you have already started migrating, you realize that there's many new namespaces now. There's basically campaign management namespacing. There's the info namespace. There's the job namespace. There's the optimization namespace. All these namespaces playing together and having to define XSI types, making sure that those are correct, and then even making sure that your request header is under the CM namespace, but it might the rest of the service might be under the job namespace. A lot of these things are very hard to keep track of, and we make sure that our client libraries are 100% compatible with the API. Another thing is we have lots of code examples. So we recently went back to our client libraries and we said, what do people have the most trouble with? And what we did is we made pretty much one example for every piece of functionality in the API. So, for campaign service, we have, someone's running a VAST. I recognize that. So for campaign service, we have add campaigns, get all pause campaigns, update campaigns, and that's just for campaign service. So pretty much every service we have a set of examples that cover all the functionality. So you could just use our examples like a toolkit and get started. So this is great for beginners. It's great for intermediate who kind of saying, well, I don't want to remember how to do this. And it's really great for maybe expert users who want to have another pair of eyes on how we're doing it. All right, and there's going to be a lot of links throughout these slides. So you don't have to copy them down. We gave you the link. Really, use these slides as you're going along in the future for just reference back to all the resources that we provide. So then there's the written part of all the resources, and these include the articles and documentation and our blog posts. So I'm sorry for all the show of hands, but how many people are reading our blog currently? Great, so that's awesome. So yeah, so you guys have seen that our blog is a great resource of finding out when things are changing in the API, looking at downtime. We have a new series called Discover v2009, which kind of talks about all the new features. And we've gotten some great feedback about how this is actually helping see all the new services that we're offering. So we're going to continue to do that as we release more services. We also have lots of articles and documentation. The three that I think are most helpful for migrating to 2009 is our What's Changed in v2009, our Migrating v13 to v2009, and our per call migration guide. So considering a lot of you have already started migrating, I assume that you guys have seen these documents. For those who haven't, you can take a look during today and let us know what you think of them and what else might be a good idea to add to these. All right, so where to start? So as I said earlier, the services that we are sunsetting on, we're turning off on April 22nd, 2010, is the campaign management stuff, so everything under the CM namespace, the site suggestion service, and the keyword tool service, which is being replaced by the targeting ideas service. We have a blog post that kind of describes how you would migrate from one to the other. So specifically today, I won't show any code examples about migrating that, but it's fairly straightforward. And then we have the info service, which has been completely rewritten. So you might want to take a look at that if you have to do any kind of unit management or operation management. Mostly tracking like free units and stuff like that. The services that aren't yet, and that's account service, report service, and traffic estimator service. All three of those are currently in the works for v2009. We haven't reached the point where we want to release those yet. When we do release them, again, we're going to get feedback. We're going to make sure that people are happy with them, that they have all the feature parity. And when we do get to the point that we realize that they have feature parity, then we'll begin the sunset clock. Okay, so we can get into the coding part. The way that I recommend going about upgrading your code, and I think Aaron touched on this briefly when he was up here, is I really like the divide and conquer method. So there's really three steps to this. There's the breaking up the code into the per service chunks. There's referencing objects by its primitive IDs. So that means, instead of passing around a campaign object, passing around maybe a long campaign ID. And then there's migrating the code chunks. So, why do I choose these three steps? Well, we have a lot of internal tools that we had to deal with, and when we tried to migrate them all just in one big kind of blob, we found that maybe our stuff wasn't as decoupled as we want it to be. So while we are breaking up the code into per service chunks and then upgrading the primitive IDs, we also noticed that it's very easy to run co-version code. So right now we don't actually offer the report service for v2009, but when you break up the code into per service chunks and these service chunks can either be in the same class or in different classes, you're able to, like, say, use ad groups of v13 and campaigns of v2009 by referencing the primitive IDs. So this is a way that you can migrate your code in steps rather than, tackling it all at once and having lots of red X's all over your Eclipse project. Okay. So I have, on the same thing that I've been showing all along, there's also an example project that you guys can follow along with. I don't think it's changed too much since I posted it there, but there might be a few differences. But basically, it's kind of just an empty project, a couple of projects that you can load into Eclipse and play along as I go along. Okay. So I'm going to switch over to Eclipse now. Can everyone see the code all right? Yep, okay. So I have one, so basically the coding example I have here is the same one as on our article of migrating from v13 to v2009. The goal of the example is to show that you can basically use v13 code along with v2009 code and how you would do that. Just to show of hands, how many people are using the Java code or Java client library? Okay, so roughly half of you are Java programmers. In the other languages, I'm guessing either .NET, PHP, or Python, one of the the other main ones. It's going to be very similar on to how you would do conversion code. Obviously, .NET would be more similar than Python, and PHP we only have v2009 right now. We really don't support Ability or have that integrated to v2009. We're suggesting to migrate to our v2009 client library, and we can take any questions about that going forward as well. So I'm going to do all my examples in Java, but that should be pretty easily transferred to any other languages. Okay, so just to get started, just want to look at my computer. We're going to start off by just kind of reviewing what you do in Java to get a service. The first thing you want to do is you want to create an AdWords user. And what this is doing is it's pulling the credentials from the basically my home directory on Windows and the properties file from it. So really briefly, we can talk about basically the credentials of v2009. The biggest change is the Authentication Token. And this is a very radical change from v13. In v13, we had basically email password, and we were expecting a lot of people to store that, and that's not very secure. So what instead we're doing is we're moving to a token-based system and use the client login API to generate this token, and then you can set the token into your client library, and you don't have to worry about having any passwords lying around. What I'll be doing going forward is just showing how to pull this properties file, which does pull an email and password and generates the client library, generates the token for it if it needs it for v2009. But all the client libraries have the functionality of either setting the token manually or pulling the email and password and having the client library generate the token for you. All right, so this is, my user is just set up so that it's just a client manager talking to a client. So basically that client is set up with a bunch of campaigns, a bunch of ad groups, keywords, and whatnot. And the goal of this piece of code is to, one, get all the campaigns, then it iterates through each campaign. It gets every ad group for the campaigns. So notice here, this is what I was talking about, that ad group service had a function called get active ad groups, which is not consistent with anything in all the other services. So again, this is just v13 code. This gets the ad groups. It then collects all the ad group IDs. It schedules a report job, which is of type ad group. We're going to call it campaign number, campaign number, because it's all the ad groups that belong to that particular campaign that we're iterating through. It's going to set the columns. It's going to set the columns as campaign, ad group, clicks, CPC, CTR. So this might be a simple report that you might do to, kind of give a performance, very, very high level performance overview of that particular campaign. Notice here that we're doing set ad groups, ad group IDs. So this already is not expecting primitive IDs. And then we just schedule a report job and then loop backwards. So again, we're going through each campaign that we find, going through each ad group, we're collecting all the ad group IDs, and then we're scheduling a report job for all those ad group IDs. So if we look back at my 3 steps, what we want to do is we want to do breakup, then we want to do primitive IDs, and then we want to migrate our code. So the first step that I would go when looking at this is saying, how can I get a general kind of way of dealing with this outer structure? So right now everything's kind of globbed together in this one class. What I want to do is maybe have, maybe a new method that gets all the AdWords campaigns, and maybe a new method that gets all the ad group IDs, and then maybe a method that schedules this actual report job. So if we go to our new code example, we're going to call it breakup. I'm going to copy text over as I go just because less typos. But I'll walk through it. So this is my new method. It's called, it's the same thing as before, which is monthly report creator. And I'm sort of speccing it out right now. I'm saying that I'm going to have this new method called get all the AdWords campaign IDs. It's going to return an int array of campaign IDs, where I'm going to show you you have to upgrade because it's v2009. It's going to go through each ID. It's then going to get all the active ad group IDs for each ID, and then it's going to schedule the campaign report for that campaign ID and those ad group IDs. So the first thing I want to do is tackle that method called get all AdWords campaign IDs. And again, this is just v13 code. Expand back. Alright, so I have this method now called get all AdWords campaign IDs. Notice that at the beginning of it, I'm creating a user. In all my methods, I'm just creating the user and creating the service, and then just sort of forgetting about them and letting the garbage collector take care of it itself. I would suggest if you're going to be using the client library that you can keep track of these users and keep track of these services. That's really big feedback to us as to how you are using these client libraries. Are you throwing away the object? Are you holding on to the object? What kind of memory performances are you seeing? If you're a reseller, you probably have tons and tons of clients that you're creating. If you're a normal user, you probably only have maybe 3 or 4 AdWords users that you're creating. But it's really important to us to make a solution that fulfills everyone's needs. All right, so I'm getting the campaign service just by doing user.getService AdWords service.v13.campaign service, and this will vary depending on the client library, but it's all generally the same, that you create this user and then you get the service from the user. I'm then getting the campaigns, running get all AdWords campaigns, and giving that dummy variable, which is just 1 in this case. I then go through every campaign and just pull out the IDs into this array, and then I return that array. So it's a nice little chunk of code that only deals with the campaign service. And I'm not dealing with campaign objects after that part. So you can imagine that instead of just returning maybe campaign IDs, I could put them into a database, I could send them along some socket, I can do whatever I want. Having these primitive IDs really allows me to explore my options, and the API is really set up to handle these primitive IDs well. Right. And the next step that I want to do is make the ad group breakout. I'm going to copy the rest of the code in there. Okay, and then I have this get active ad group IDs. And remember, this is the next step in the loop. This is just pulling out all the ad groups the same way we pulled out the campaigns and collecting the IDs together. Notice that these ad group IDs are long. So again, where were we? We had just generated the campaign IDs and the ad group IDs. Going up to this top loop, we have campaign IDs coming from get all AdWords campaign IDs, which is what I made, which is what I created. I go through each of those and I get all the active ad group IDs. I then schedule this campaign report, which I'll now show you right now, which takes that one campaign ID that I'm iterating through and all the ad group IDs that belong to that campaign. So going down here on the bottom, You notice the same little overhead every time. I get the user, I create the service, and then I just define the report job and set all the fields that I talked about before. So I'm just taking that coded chunk that was existing in the for loop before and moving it to its own method. All right, so the key thing that I want people to look at before we go to upgrading this to v2009, notice that this is an integer array for campaign IDs right now. In v2009, campaign IDs moved to long values. That's not because we ran out of integers for campaigns. It was more along the lines of all the other IDs were longs to begin with, and it just was kind of a pain to have, all the IDs being longs, and then having campaign be int. And this was a direct feedback from everybody. So this is an example of feedback working itself back in to the API. All right, so we'll move to the upgrade section. So notice that I still have the same method now. I've just changed campaign IDs to long instead of int. So that was the beauty of breaking out. My main logic part of the code remains completely unchanged when I'm upgrading because I'm only dealing with primitive values. So now I'm able to say, okay, I'm going to start by upgrading get all Adwords campaign IDs to v2009. What I'll do is I'll copy over the upgrade part and then walk through it. Okay, so notice I still have my get all Adwords campaign IDs. And this is my old example from v13. Sorry, I'm in the wrong file. So I'm just going to paste this in here. And what I'm going to do now is this part of code is already now updated to v2009. So notice it's the same overhead. We have the user, then we do the get service, and now we have this service client for v2009. The only difference is before I had .v13, and now I have .v200909. So you still have to worry about imports and using this correct object. So it looks simple. It's deceiving a little bit, but if you notice up here, you'll see that I have a mixture of v13 and v2009 objects. So right now I have the v2009 campaign objects, and I have the v13 report objects sitting there. And those can interact just fine with each other because they use primitive values. I wouldn't, for example, be able to say add campaign in v13 with the v2009 campaign. They wouldn't be able to fit. So this is why we can do co-version code, but we need to be careful about which version we're dealing with when we deal with complex objects. Okay, so let's walk through the get all Adwords campaigns for v2009. So the first part is I get the user, then I get the service, and at this point, because it's v2009, it's generating the authentication token for me. And then setting that in this campaign service object in the request headers portion. The next step is I want to create a selector. And this is where v2009 really differs from v13. In v2009, we have selectors and get methods as opposed to get all methods. So these selectors allow you to pull out individual campaigns by ID, maybe pull out campaigns that only have a certain status. It really depends on the selector for each service, and it'd be great if you guys told us what do you want to see in those selectors. Maybe someone wants to pull out all campaigns that have a certain click-through rate of this or that. Like things like that are really great feedback in terms of what you want these selectors to do. Notice that I'm supplying an empty selector. When you supply an empty selector through the API, that just means get all. So in this case, I'm just sending in an empty selector. I get the campaign page back, and then I'm going through the campaign page .entries, which is all those entries in the page, and I'm just selecting the campaign IDs out of all those entries in the page and putting them into an array. So specifically right here, I do campaign page.get entries, which is an array of campaigns. I pick out the one that I'm iterating through, and then I just say .get ID on it. So this is a subject that I don't think a lot of people grasp, is the paging aspect. In some of our selectors, not all just yet, but we're making sure that we get consistent. you're able to page through objects. So you're able to say, give me 500 objects at a time, and then offset by this, then offset by this, then offset by this. So the start index changes, and the total result set size will determine how many pages that you want to get. So you would just have a while loop, and you would go through it and say, give me 500, change the start index, give me the next 500, change the start index, give me the next 500, or sorry, change the offset. It really depends on, I think, I'm not, let me double check really quickly. I'm not sure if it's start index or, right, so the paging object has, so you would pass it in a new paging. And then that takes a start index and a number, yeah, so you would give it a new start index every time that you get a page. So the paging object has start index and then number of results. So if I want to do 500 at a time, I would just say number of results 500, and I would just change the start index from 0 to then 500 to then 1,000, and then I would get 500 objects every time.
So it's part of the selector then? I guess if there are code examples, I can check those, but I was confused by that.
Yeah, so I think that's one of the things that's a little bit confusing is the whole paging aspect, just because it's completely new to v2009. It's very good feedback that there's no code examples for it right now besides what we do in targeting idea service. I believe we do paging in that. But I think that's a good point, and we'll be adding an example to all the client libraries to show paging through objects. But again, it's pretty simple. I'll just show you really quickly. You'll notice that campaign selector takes a number of things like IDs, statuses that I want to select. I know it's a small font, so I'm reading it. Stats that you want to select, and then the last one is paging. And then again, when you send in a paging object, that's my last, it would be my last thing, so I would do null for everything. And then in my last one, I would send in a paging. This takes a start index, so I would give it 0 and then 500. And this would take out the first 500 objects. And then on my next iteration through, I might do start index of 500 and then tell it 500 again. And that will pull the next 500. So at this point, I'm now done migrating my campaign service stuff to v2009. If I still have my v13 stuff lying around for ad groups, it would then work in the same program. Because I have separated everything out into services and dealing with just the primitive IDs, the objects don't collide with each other, and you're able to use the two different sub-clients for both v13 and v2009. So the next step is then upgrading the get all ad groups. I'm going to copy that portion over. So I'll just walk through this really quickly. I'm getting my user, as always, generating the ad group service, which generates my authentication token. I'm then creating a selector for ad groups. Each selector is defined by its object that it's going to be selecting. So you would see something like, let me just import everything, get rid of these reds. Every time that you create a selector, it'd be like ad group selector, campaign selector, targeting idea selector. All these different things define the different selectors. So basically, ad group selector is very specific to the ad group service. It has a lot of different things that you can set. One of them is the campaign ID. So when I give an ad group selector a campaign ID, that says give me all the ad groups that exist underneath this campaign. So notice now that our get method only has one object, which is selector. So now in v13, where we were passing in all the different parameters to the method, which caused a lot of bloat with that method sometimes, now we have a lot more dynamic selector objects, which you only have to set the things that you care about. So it gives you a lot cleaner code, like I've shown below. Okay, so just following the same structure that I had before, I have this ad group page, and again, I can page through the results if I wanted to. What I'm going to do is I'm then going to go through all the different ad groups in the entities. So, basically this get entities is just an array of ad groups. I go through all of them, and I just add these. I check to see if the ad group status is enabled. If it is, then I add it to the list of active AdGroup IDs. And then I just turn this into a primitive long array, and then return it back through the method. So now this method is now upgraded to v2009. And because those were the only two methods that relied on v2009, I have my old method of schedule campaign report that I don't need to change. Because I broke up all the services into different methods, this one only relied on having a campaign ID and a list of AdGroup IDs, which I've now upgraded to my v2009. So now this little program is completely upgraded and ready to go. So that concludes the coding portion of today. So I will open it up to any Q&A now, and I'll leave it on this slide right here. The main takeaways from today, again, are that April 22nd is fast approaching, and we think the client libraries are one of the better ways of upgrading to v2009. If you can't use the client library, please let us know. I really like the feedback so far in the client libraries, and we are going to be taking this feedback and immediately integrating it into our libraries, because the feedback that you guys get today is extremely of high priority. It's direct feedback, which trumps all else. We're here to help. We have the forums, which I think are the best way to get answers. Either you can search the forums, or you can ask questions on there, and people will, either other forum members will answer them, or we have a dedicated staff that will answer the questions in the forum as well. We have the documentation, such as we have the resources like documentation, articles, and blog posts, and just divide and conquer, and jump in and take a stab at it, and let us know what you're having difficulty with and how we can help.